You're listening to Errol Parker and Clancy Overall, editors of the Batuta Advocate, on Desert Rock FM. Well, welcome back to the Batuta Advocate radio show, recording live here from downtown Batuta. We've got Errol Parker back on deck. You're joined by myself, Clancy Overall, as well. And it's been quite a big week in news, as I'm sure everyone's aware. Sydney's numbers continue to spike north. Looks like it might have gotten away from Melbourne as well, which isn't good news for anyone down there. We're starting to realise just how contagious and how almost, what's the word? Infectious, but the high viral load of this Delta variant.
Yeah, apparently they were saying on the news this morning as I was watching, they were saying that, you know, the sewage all over New South Wales was glowing green. They were saying, you know, the viral load was high and virile, they were saying.
Not good news for anyone. Of course, up here in the proud deep north, we continue to soldier on. COVID can't kill us, can't infect us.
COVID doesn't like the heat. Doesn't
like that corrugated iron curtain that we put up on the border either. It can't get through. So hates the heat, hates Queenslanders, and we hate it.
Yep.
Elsewhere in the news, though.
Yes, it all pales in comparison to what is happening in Afghanistan. You know, we do have this, you know, it's a super flu that is deleting our elderly and our sick at a rate of knots. You know, it's keeping a lot of people inside their lovely houses with access to food and water, shelter. But of course, what's happening over in Afghanistan is really puts a lot of the struggles that most Australians go through each day into perspective.
Absolutely. And the global news cycle hasn't been good for the soul this week. We've seen, on top of what's happening in Afghanistan, we've seen, you know, bushfires, the climate fires in Greece. France is starting to light up as well. And, of course, poor old Lebanon still have not recovered from the explosion in Beirut 12 months ago. There's vast parts of that country that are without power or fuel. Yeah, not a lot of good coming out of there right now. Afghanistan, obviously, though, this week has been the one where we've seen the most emotive images coming out of. We saw everything happening at the airport there in Kabul, and we're seeing the subsequent fallout from the Taliban, I guess, taking control of the major cities over there and the collapse of the Afghan armed forces. In today's episode, we're going to speak to someone who probably can't speak to what's happening right now, but in this last 20 years, we've seen 20 years of conflict, and this man was there for quite some time in the middle of all that. Harry Sanna, he's a videographer, a journalist, and philanthropist. Yeah, just a general storyteller who's going to be able to tell us a little bit about the very complicated situation over there and their history, their modern history at least. Thank you for joining us today, Harry Sanna.
Thanks for having me on board.
Now, Harry, can you just tell us what your thoughts were this week, your initial thoughts, because they would be very different to the rest of us. We know Australians are particularly complicit when it comes to, you know, unstable countries or destabilised countries, and there's often no one can help them, or they've been at it for years. But, you know, that is the truth. But you were there for some of those years. So can you just tell us some of the feelings you had seeing those images earlier this week?
Yeah, of course. Look, I think kind of the shocking nature of it was more in the speed and relative, I guess, peaceful success of the Taliban's push into Kabul. Yeah. I don't think anyone that had been keeping even a long eye on the country expected it to hold out to the Taliban for too long, but a matter of days and hours by the end of it, I think came as a shock to pretty much everyone.
There's all this talk of the Afghan armed forces collapsing. You know, obviously the American way out is by saying they didn't try hard enough and they didn't want to win, which is a pretty interesting thing to say a month after you left them.
Yeah. No, I think obviously it's intrinsically far more complicated than that. I don't think it's a matter of their heart being in it or not. I think traditionally, historically, at least for the last 20 years of this coalition war in Afghanistan, I think the motivations is kind of something that kind of really needs to be understood and kind of talked about in the forefront. I mean, at the end of the day, the US forces over there were doing it as part of a mission objective that constantly changed, from initially eradicating terrorism and obviously an immediate kind of knee-jerk reaction to September 11, and then kind of turned into this kind of slightly amorphous nation-building effort to kind of institute some sense of democracy and unify a country that traditionally has kind of never really been unified linguistically, culturally, economically, or militarily. Look, I think at the end of the day, the Afghan National Army's, apparent sort of melting away, kind of pretty much entire dissolution in the spate of, a couple of months, couple of weeks, and then a couple of days, shouldn't come as a huge surprise, really.
Yeah. So when you say they haven't been unified in the sense that it's not necessarily a warring nation of divisions, but it is, it's not like Australia where some kid from Perth joins the army, gets sent to Duntroon, and they have this, centralised kind of system where all the politicians go to Canberra and all these people speak the same language and they have elected representatives to represent certain industries in certain regions who all answer to the one leader. That's never really been the case.
No. Culturally, it's pretty isolationist, and what the American forces, and I guess the international forces as well, but obviously very much driven by the Americans early on, did was pick, I guess, applicable, savvy warlords that they thought they could essentially fund back and control, that then they just basically walked into power early on, and that comes from Karzai and, a bunch of these senior politicians. They essentially legitimized a certain subsect of kind of the nation to control, and that's not a new concept. That's been done plenty of times before, unfortunately, in history. But I think fundamentally what they tried to do was instill a sense of national sovereignty in a nation that never really understood it, has never really kind of worked with the concept. Yeah. And that's, no slight against the Afghan people at all. I think it's kind of a square peg round hole, and I think that's coming to the fore pretty intensely now.
Do you think the Taliban have that ability to unite?
Well, I certainly think they have the fear factor at this stage. What you're seeing, which is pretty inspiring and honestly pretty remarkable at the moment, is the citizenry rising up in certain places, Jalalabad yesterday, and journalists who have been trained and reared during the American occupation there that have a sense of, I guess, democratic hunger. Mm-hmm. And they're calling out the Taliban because the Taliban are holding press conferences now. The whole kind of thing feels very surreal. Yeah. And, I think there is certainly a lot of, very brave people there that will call the Taliban to account. Whether the Taliban can actually maintain control of the country, I feel like anyone that's talking about Afghanistan in any way at the moment doesn't want to say too much because it's been such a fluid situation. But I think if it's going to be them nation building and kind of retaining and kind of regaining control of the country in any way, it'll be definitely driven by fear for the time being. The obvious concern is a very light word to use, but is that it'll descend into bloodshed. Mm-hmm. But so far, it hasn't. And that has been, I think, probably a positive that a lot of people
surprise though for someone like you that spent time there. Is that a surprise?
Yeah, I think so. My time there was I lived in country for a couple of years, but sort of travelled there and worked there from 2008 through to 2012-13, and Taliban at that time, which were essentially a fighting force that mobilised, trained, and I guess kind of got their shit together in Pakistan during the off-season, during the winter season, and then in spring, which was called the fighting season, used to flood back over the border and hit all these American positions in the east and the south pretty hard. I think an ongoing legacy will be kind of a respect for the Taliban's endurance.
Yeah, because they were coming across, from Pakistan into places like Kandahar, Helmand, across those places. But just for those people who are listening at home, Harry, what brought you to Afghanistan and what were you doing there?
Sure.
So you weren't a David Hicks. You weren't a
no.
You weren't a sympathiser at all with the people. You're
a journalist.
Yes, but you were also a freelance as well. Yeah. You weren't sent there by anyone.
No, that's right. Well, I was based in South Asia at the time, in Delhi first, and then Pakistan for a little while. It was one of the biggest stories going on there, and kind of as a young journo trying to kind of cut my teeth in more complicated parts of the world, to put it that way. It was, an incredibly appealing story to cover. And I think that's what got me over there to start. And then, I think I became a bit obsessed with the story for a time.
Mm-hmm. I just want to go into how someone who isn't with, I guess, an Australian newspaper, because at the time there were overseas bureaus for major mastheads.
Yeah.
You weren't with any of them. You weren't with the ABC. You were kind of I guess you'd say a backpacker / journo in the subcontinent, sending work back home.
Sending work, I did a lot of work for American press at the time. There was a time I worked for Al Jazeera for a little bit. I would just do basically as a freelancer. Yeah, you're essentially a gun for hire without a gun. And that's kind of what my position and role was there. As time wore on in country in Afghanistan, you develop contacts, you develop relationships, both within the kind of US military, which was kind of in that time the easiest and kind of most approachable way of getting around the country.
That's how you did it. You approached them?
So they're essentially the Qantas of Afghanistan at the time.
Fundamentally, you could call them that. Yeah, you could call them that. They probably wouldn't call themselves that. But so they had Americans pushed something called the Embed program, which was essentially pairing journalists with different American and Afghan units all around the country. And that's very much part of a structure of American propaganda in some ways, and I guess fundamentally that is something that I was conscious of at the time, and I certainly think people are more conscious of now, that the narratives that you would spin kind of from within the system of the American military, you're essentially going out with these men and women that are protecting you. They're the ones with the guns, and you're in an active war zone. So anytime you're in a firefight, I'm ducking like a fucking moron, hoping someone's going to shoot us out of it, you know? And I think in that way it kind of comes with its own challenges of remaining
scant
and kind of.
How do you deal with that, knowing that you've approached, for example, a certain unit of the American Army and said, "Can I please come with you to wherever you're going next? I want to put cameras on you." They say yes, knowing full well. Obviously the American, as you mentioned before, they have a way of, that actually makes them look good by bringing someone like you with them. But the soldiers don't necessarily think that. So what do you do in that circumstance where they now know that they've got some long-haired Australian bloke that they've also got to keep an eye on as well as themselves? How would you work with them?
Yeah, look, it kind of differed from unit to unit and kind of whatever the, the mission objective of these particular units or battalions or what have you are. I was with the Marines in the South in Helmand, you mentioned before, and the 101st Airborne in the East for a while, and then a Medivac unit. And so different parts of the country, different missions. The mileage varied on journalists being along for the ride, particularly in places that were kind of hard fought and kind of encountered a lot of firefights, a lot of blood and guts kind of every day. I think having a journalist around might have slowed their roll a little bit. Yeah. But I think in some ways that's probably as good a thing as it is a bad thing. Yeah.
So what did the country look like when you arrived there in 2008? Like from what we saw, earlier on this year, that Afghanistan had essentially returned to some sense of normality. What was it like, 13 years ago?
Well, I'll probably talk to sort of 2009 onwards, because that's when I was sort of in country a lot more.
And how old were you when you dropped yourself in there?
First up, I think I was 22, 23, I know. Which, sounds ridiculously young and stupid, but, I was still a year or two older than most of the American soldiers there, So in that
Never
way...
thought of that, actually.
I know. It's a weird thing. But, look, the 2009 Obama, one of his kind of first sort of acts when he kind of landed in office was order a troop surge in Afghanistan, which happened in 2009. And so the idea was to kind of reinvigorate and rout out the Taliban in some of these kind of heartland areas in the south and the east. And so kind of suddenly you had like 100,000 plus more boots on the ground there.
Yeah.
And there was kind of this sense of momentum where it kind of felt like it was maybe flagging a little bit before. Suddenly you had troops, you had tanks, you kind of had the full apparatus of the American military machine kind of just descending on this country. And there was kind of, I guess in some ways there was a sense of optimism. But then again, I mean, and this is, I think, probably an important point. I was just this week going through some of my old stories, coverage of Afghanistan during that time, and then into sort of 2010-11. Wrote a story about a valley in Afghanistan called Pesh Valley, which is sort of at the mouth of the Korangal Valley, and this was kind of a really intense area of fighting. There was a doco called Restrepo, came out about around that time, that was about a unit in Korangal Valley. It was one of the bloodiest fights in the war at that time. And just kind of looking back at some of the kind of little bits and colour and things that I'd sort of pulled out for that story, you know, there was this feeling that probably the Americans would withdraw out of that area over the coming months. And talking to those Afghan National Army guys at the time and some of the local elders and all of that, there was a sense that they said, look, Taliban will come in the moment the Americans step out of here. And I mean, we're talking an article I wrote 10 years ago.
Yeah. Right.
There was a this valley in Kunar province in eastern Afghanistan, right along the side Pakistan, the border there. There was 101st Airborne was kind of weighing up the option of kind of withdrawing from that area at the time. And the Afghan National Army, all these interviews I did at that time, they said, you know, the moment the Americans leave, we do not have the firepower, the training, the discipline to kind of withstand a Taliban push at this time. And, you know, 10 years later, look where we are.
So where was the Taliban at this time? I mean, they're obviously out in the field. They were in Pakistan. They were fighting. But as soon as the Americans would leave, you know, where would the Taliban kind of materialize from? Like, were they just kind of like they're lying dormant?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is kind of where you get, I think, where rightly and wrongly comparisons of Vietnam kind of come up pretty strongly. I mean, the Taliban, you know, they dress differently. They obviously were lugging around small and medium arms and things like that. So they kind of stood out from your average local Afghan. But at the same time, I mean, the war, and particularly in those heavy areas of fighting down in the south and in the east, I mean, the Americans paid a lot of locals to fight on their behalf. A lot of those soldiers were Afghan National Army, Afghan National Police, Afghan Border Police, but then a lot of others were kind of irregulars, I guess you'd call them. And it was basically just a war of just kind of economic attrition in some ways, and kind of who would essentially pay these guys to fight. And so obviously, kind of as part of the American withdrawal, you're kind of losing these economic incentives, but you're also really losing air support and kind of the fear of the American military, which was kind of pervasive and did keep the Taliban away. Yeah. So I guess I sort of took that question a few directions, but I mean, to answer it, either across the border or they weren't Taliban at the time.
Taliban were in plain sight.
They were cops or something, you know.
There's obviously the hard trained fighters, but they were the folks that kind of poured back over the border.
Is that part of it? So is this what we're seeing now with this collapse of a government and military? Is it maybe
now the Taliban's got the biggest checkbook in the country? So
they got the
and but also this isn't like we're coming into bat for, say, you know, let's look at Yugoslavia, for example, formerly known as. We could have, you know, and the Australian Army or the American Army could have jumped on any one of those warring sides during, you know, their civil war, and they would have had a local army that were fighting for something. Mm-hmm. In Afghanistan, we had to create that.
Yeah, fundamentally. I mean, but by like what I was saying before about sort of trying to kind of instill a sense of national sovereignty around a centralized government in Kabul, you're essentially trying to create a nation state where there never was one before. And I mean, you know, the Taliban was, in the 90s, they sprung out of a vacuum that the Russians left when they kind of failed after their 10 years of war in the 80s, and emerged after a pretty brutal civil war, victorious in the late 90s, and then you've got 2001. That's kind of all sort of, there's something cyclical about it.
Yeah, they've got the runs on the board, really. Like, they know how to win at home, I guess, don't they?
They do. And we're talking kind of incredibly seasoned and experienced fighters. And, they've had the motivation in a way that no one else has. They've had drive, endurance, and motivation. And I mean, the Afghan National Army was kind of pulled from across Afghanistan, across these ethnic linguistic lines, and told to kind of fight for basically a wage, because at the same time there was no real belief in the system of centralized government in Kabul, and part of that is because of rampant corruption, and part of that is because it's not something that's existed in the mindset. I mean, there was talk of this war, winning this war by generation, and now they've been there essentially a generation, but obviously it was going to take longer. And I don't think the withdrawal by any means was the wrong call. I mean, how long do you stay there as an international occupying force? I think certainly, and I mean, this is logistical calamities seems to be a bit of a buzz term for the last couple of years in general in the world. I think this particular withdrawal in Afghanistan, what's happened since the Taliban reoccupied Kabul, will go down as one of the greatest logistical calamities of the 21st century.
Do you reckon this is something that will be remembered? Like, there's certain things in the American empire that everyone remembers. It was an arrow to the knee. Hurricane Katrina was one of them, where they really fell short there, and they probably lost a lot of faith in themselves. Vietnam War was definitely one of them. Do you reckon this will be our...
George Bush hates black people.
Kanye West, basically. You know, put that one out there for us. But there were a lot of different moments. George Floyd, for example. This is the defining of the century.
Look, I mean, if you look at this week and the fall of Kabul as a bookend to a row of tomes that started at September 11 as the other side of the bookcase, I think you could comfortably, from an armchair, call it a decline of American imperialism. I mean, I think that's a legacy that will come up. And I mean, look, I think something certainly not to turn away from, and something to kind of really, I think, probably champion over the coming months and years, is the mental health of the people that were involved in that war. Those that served here in Australia, overseas. Of course, first and foremost at the moment, the focus and the attention from policymakers, from the media, from the general global public should be on the safety of the Afghan people and a hopefully fairly peaceful transferal of full power across the country back to the Taliban without, too much bloodshed, but also too many concessions lost. I mean, particularly around female education, empowerment of women in general. I mean, that's obviously a huge concern. I mean, I don't think fundamentally, globally, there's a lot of trust in the Taliban that will continue, but I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, this has been a surprising week in the country, but
there's been a bit of a mask off this week with the Taliban, hasn't there? Who are we dealing with here?
I know, it's fascinating. And you've got some of these old commanders that have kind of come.
Like, there's one that's like had a 4.5-year holiday in Cuba, and now he's back in Kabul.
I know, it's unbelievable. Imagine being a fly on the wall following these guys over the last 20 years.
It's coming home.
I know.
He'd have. I mean, like, every year you get these autobiographies from cricketers and sports stars. I mean, that's the story I want to read. Like, gone from, being
exile,
a child when, the Soviets were in there to seeing the Americans pour a bunch of money into the Mujahideen, to,
look, it
9/11, the war.
Look, it has been a dramatic few decades for Afghanistan. I mean, close to half a century. I mean, you could stretch it back. I mean, they called it the graveyard of empires, and, going back to the Great Game, which was sort of when the kind of British colonial powers were fighting the Russians, and now you've kind of got Chinese interests there, you've got the Pakistanis, you've got India, you've got the States. I mean, it's kind of a really fascinating is perhaps not lending to the grim nature of it for the people on the ground there, but you've got a place that has been a nexus of geopolitical kind of saber rattling and saber swinging for so long now. I mean, it's what's next? I mean,
it speaks to something though, doesn't it? It's like, and I think it's of great interest to everyone in the world that the Afghan people, while in this last 20 years, you kind of look around the world, all the countries that joined in on that war with America, like the globalization of this effort didn't take much. You know what I mean?
No.
It wasn't hard to get a bunch of people to be on the side of America. It wasn't, we've experienced, I guess, the internet in that time. We've experienced, generations around the world who are now all watching NBA in the back of back of Brisbane. We've got there's a globalization that's happening elsewhere in the world, and that's why Afghanistan's so interesting, that they have just not flinched on anything, despite having Americans in there paying $300 million a day to make them into a system like theirs, that they were able to not do that.
No, that's right. I mean,
and the Russians did that before, would you say?
Yeah, no, I mean, the Russians did. Russians didn't put nearly as much of an investment in as the Americans have, both in time, I think half the time, and certainly a fraction of the money. But I think, I mean, it can't be not seen as a tragedy in any way, shape or form. I mean, it's the loss of life, fundamentally, obviously. But I think it's what's hard and what's, I think, really important, and especially for listeners, I think, is on an Australian context, considering, the servicemen and women that were over there at this time. I think there'll be a real struggle with the perceived futility of the whole endeavour.
For sure.
I mean, we're talking 20 years. And a lot of people lost a lot of friends, family members. People lost limbs. People have been affected by it in untold ways.
I mean, it's also it's important to point out that while this thing has its 20-year regime has not netted the results that we thought. We weren't even sure what the results we were looking for were. That's not to say, obviously, the people that went there weren't the best of the best, and they were. And I'm sure the Americans you saw were absolutely top to bottom military men and women. It was just a completely different thing to what everyone thought they were getting into.
Yeah, I mean, there is partly that. I think partly as well, though. I mean, to go back to what I was saying before about the motivation and I guess grit and determination of the Taliban kind of eventually winning out just by time alone. I mean, you've got American service members as well as Australia and every coalition member that kind of joined that fight early on. You've got a situation where people are joining up for all kinds of reasons. I mean, America saw, millions of people through Afghanistan, their own, men and women. And I think what's not to be kind of lost and forgotten there is, beyond sort of the mission and the fact that they were doing their jobs over there, a lot of people sign up to the military for tertiary education, for corrective eye surgery. It's a job.
Like healthcare.
Healthcare. Exactly. So,
in the States, that is.
Yeah, that's right. No,
I mean,
states. I am talking specifically about America, and when I do talk about this stuff, I did not have a lot of back and forth with the Australian military over there. They weren't as open with journalists, and particularly because of our special forces kind of role there, we had a lot more special forces on the ground, and obviously, news considering what's happened,
it's classified. Harry.
Yeah, it's classified. Yeah, that's right. So I mean, I think when we're talking about America specifically, I mean, I've got a ton of respect.
It is different.
It is different. It is. No. It's a good point to count.
Australians are joining the army often from army families, and they want to protect their country. And they could do that in the police force, and they could do that in many ways, or they could have any other job here.
And otherwise, it's a great job.
Yeah, it's a great job
in this country.
Yeah,
it's a fantastic job. It offers so much to so many people. In that, it's not just where you go and get things. It's where you go and grow into something. You know,
But
it's
in the States, it's emancipation.
Look,
in America, it's getting the fuck out of bumfuck Idaho. Really, is.
Yeah, look, I mean, and not to in any way cast aspersions or dispute the American morale, because I feel like it's as strong as anywhere in the world. And I feel like, not to dispute the American morale and the kind of ethos of the military, because, I mean, I think it's kind of one of the most powerful, and when I say powerful, I mean strongly believed by the individual service members in the world. I mean,
Ideology.
Ideology. I mean, America's kind of a fascinating place for that, and certainly kind of, I think, acts as an interesting counterpoint to Australia in general, when we talk about kind of jingoistic kind of approaches to nationalism. I mean, but I do think, with experience to the Americans, and I produced a film a couple of years ago following a American medevac unit, incredibly brave men and women who were on a Black Hawk helicopter and would fly out to front lines all over the country in Afghanistan and pick up dead, wounded, seriously injured, and that would go for coalition service members, local Afghans, Taliban, locals that were giving birth, anything really. They were just kind of a paramedic kind of organization that was part of the US military for sure. But I mean, I think mental health for service people that were over in Afghanistan is going to be and should be at the forefront of everyone's minds going forward. Mm-hmm. I mean, if the legacy of Afghanistan, deemed by kind of the public at large, the global audience, is going to be, what a futile waste of fucking time. Well,
they start using words like pointless, and aside from the trauma they're carrying from service and from literally gunfire, and explosions and shot at, and seeing their mates die, if that wasn't bad enough, now being told by the general population that what they did was pointless. That doesn't feel like a good place to be.
No. And I think the legacy of Vietnam and kind of, I mean, this all happened kind of before our time. Three of us in this room, but I think the whole baby killer kind of I mean, if we've learnt one thing from that, it's that it's incredibly destructive, and there's a generation of people, couple of generations now, considering the length of the Afghan war, that will be carrying that for the rest of their lives, and we need to be very careful. Absolutely. And we also need to be incredibly supportive. And, for those listening that are in that position, I mean, I'm not saying anything you haven't heard before, but seek help, talk to the people around you, and vocalize. I mean, I think that's really important. Don't sit with this, because it's not easy. It's not easy for anyone that was there in country, and I think it's going to feel off and wrong, and I guess it's up to everyone to try and decide where that line is.
Seek help, and if you're not getting help from the people that said they'd give you help, call Jackie Lambie's office, and she will sort you out. We got a lot of love for Jackie in Batuta. She's fighting the good fight for the veterans. So wise words there, Harry.
Well, Harry, when I suppose that the documentary you made, Trauma, it's basically in two parts for those who haven't seen it at home. The first part, you're in country with these boys from the medevac unit, and kind of the second part is when you're revisiting them again once they've gotten back to America. What stuck out to you about the changes that these men had gone through once they'd gotten home? Yeah,
I think I liken it a little bit to sort of, the old kind of stage magic show trick of kind of sawing the assistant in half. I feel like when you go out and you are involved in combat in any way, shape or form, really, but particularly if it's in a foreign country, fighting for reasons that may seem fairly amorphous to you personally, I think what it does is it kind of saws you in half, and I think returning home is kind of that part of the magic show where they're spinning you around in one side and you see the feet sticking out the other side of a box, but you're part of the magic trick. You don't have any idea how it's feeling, and I feel like it's incredibly hard to fuse those two parts of you back together.
Yeah.
And I think for, every one of those individuals I covered in trauma, as well as kind of many veterans at large, I think trying to marry the experiences of kind of combat in a tour or multiple tours overseas and home life, being a mother, being a son, being a functioning member of society in some ways can be really challenging. It's not across the board, but I think a lot of people struggle with it, especially in the early days.
How long would a tour be?
Depended on the unit. Marines were, again, I'm talking America here. US Marines were 6 months, US Army 12. But sometimes that would shift. Missions changed, things happened.
Yeah.
But, we're talking, some of the guys that I covered in my documentary, as well as other people I, had experiences with working there as a journalist, they were doing 3, 4, 5 tours. And you're thinking at the time, there's Iraq war going on in the early days as well. So they were bouncing between Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, well, no.
Fuck.
I know.
They were saying in the War Crimes Inquiry here that there were 6 instances of Special Forces guys that done like 13 to 15 tours.
Yeah.
So that's basically every year back to back, just spending that, like there is no break at all. Like there's no coming back to Perth and hanging out at Swanbourne or anything. It's just 15 years of non-stop fighting.
Getting close to half your life for a lot of those blokes.
Yeah.
So you just look at where we're at in Australia right now, where we're looking like a good part of this country could spend a good part of a year in lockdown. Mm-hmm. And you look at those people who are now wondering, will I be the same when I come out of this? Mm-hmm. Will life go back to normal?
Yeah.
Just imagine that, except you're not in your living room. You're in the desert in the Middle East with gunfire, with a bunch of people that you have had to form very quick relationships with and bonds with. And you might even see a couple of them die in front of you.
Yeah, that's
and then we talk about lockdown ends in Afghanistan and you arrive back in Kentucky and you try to go to church on Sunday and you try and get a subway and you're trying to go back to work as a, whatever else your brothers and mates are doing.
Yeah.
You got to see that firsthand, Harry?
Yeah. No, look, a lot of that. And I think, just life over there as a foreign soldier in Afghanistan, I think is, every single facet of it is so fundamentally at its core different to what life at home is like for most. And some of these observation posts and far off operating bases and things like that, the toilet essentially is kind of an area of the sandbags where you shit into a plastic bag and throw it over the HESCOs or the sandbags, because you can't ever stand up because of incoming fire. When you're kind of putting it down to sort of, the core indignities.
How you take a shit is remarkably different in this environment.
And expand from there, from shitting onwards.
Too dangerous to stand up.
Yeah.
So would you say in that sense, and how different that world is in general? War in itself, but how different Afghanistan is as the people of that vast land who don't all identify as compatriots of one another.
Yeah.
Would you say that speaks to why no one has ever been able to defeat them? In the sense the value systems are so different that even with a $1 trillion American military coming in, they just can't read this landscape.
Look, if you look at pictures of the Afghan landscape, the physical landscape, you're talking about an incredibly, in parts of the country, particularly around the east in the Hindu Kush, which kind of leads eventually into the Himalayas and things, it's incredibly beautiful. It's kind of Tolkien-esque, but it's rugged and it's harsh. And down south, you've got these deserts and kind of these poppy plantations and things like that. Like I said before, country after country going back to sort of Alexander the Great has sort of, I guess, washed and broken on its shores. It's a landlocked country, but I use it metaphorically. But it's an incredibly stoic in every kind of way of the word place. Yeah. And I think a word that I've seen kind of thrown around in the media this week, and I kind of have mixed emotions about, is using the term kind of the last 20 years as sort of an experiment in democracy, as American kind of imperialistic exported democracy as a concept. I don't know how I feel about it, but it's an interesting idea to think. And I mean, 20 years doesn't certainly seem like it has been enough. And I think in some ways the war entirely has been a failure if you just look at it quite clearly and objectively. But I think, I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's tremendously sad for everyone involved. I mean, first and foremost, the Afghan people who, regardless of what side of the line they came down on and kind of whether they supported the US invasion and the coalition invasion and kind of what their feelings were towards the Taliban throughout the years, you know, they just haven't been able to catch a fucking break in so long, in so many generations now. You just, your heart goes out for them.
So a lot of what you've covered, obviously there was some years you spent there, but obviously your what you spent a lot of time on after you came back was this documentary Trauma, which tells the story of Afghanistan through the eyes of the medivacs. Where can people find that now? That's on Apple iTunes and Amazon. Amazon Prime, so it can be found there. And I guess to put it
Tug too, and Vimeo too, on demand.
On demand, I believe it is. Vimeo on demand. That's right.
Well, look, I think you can go to trauma.film.
Yeah,
that's right,
and you'll find it.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's right. So fundamentally, I guess if you wanted to give it a watch, it's a story, as these guys said, about an American medevac unit, and it's told over the course of about 6-7 years, from the time I first met them in 2010-11, and then I follow them back and forth from home life back to country again, and tell the story of how they assimilate back into society.
I really liked it because it's such a rare insight into what it was like there that hasn't been put through, you know, the washing machine of commercial television or through, you know, a state kind of media outlet like the ABC. This is, you know, it's essentially you and these guys. Yeah, basically.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, it was really important for me to just kind of essentially be the single point of contact throughout for this particular unit from the time there. And obviously I sort of earned, I'd like to hope, I earned my time with them in the subsequent years, spending time in their homes and with their families back in the US, from the time I spent with them in the helicopter. But yeah, I think it offers certainly not a broad narrative of Afghanistan. I don't know if one of those can be given at this stage, but it offers a window into a small slice of that war. And, you know, I hope people take something away from it.
Well, thank you for joining us, Harry. That was a small and informative kind of insight into your time there and everything that's going on in the news. One thing I do want to ask is, you just mentioned before, as we finish up, Afghanistan is rugged, Afghanistan is beautiful, and it is very varied in its landscape. What was the most beautiful thing you saw there?
Look, I mean, beautiful in terms of the landscape. I think certainly the eastern part of the country, around those sort of really high mountainous areas of the Hindu Kush, you've got kind of villages that have been entirely built out of stone, and these kind of ancient rivers. I mean, you know, we were talking before about, you know, the legacy of Vietnam. If you look at Vietnam now as a holiday destination, I mean, it seems surreal and perhaps even the wrong thing to kind of posit as a concept, certainly at this stage. But I mean, the country is a outdoor paradise in many ways. I mean, the tragedy that's befallen all the people there will never be washed out of those mountains, but it is mountainous and green and intensely blue rivers. Again, I'm talking the eastern part of the country, and the people there, the people in these villages. I mean, in the midst of the war, and while I was being essentially ferreted along, kind of behind American patrols that kind of were going in, you know, the children that kind of were still sort of running around being kids. I mean, it was, beautiful to see as much as it was tragic.
Well, we hope for more of that kind of imagery coming out of there
Yeah.
in the next generation.
Look, let's see. Let's see.
Well, thanks for joining us today, Harry. That's Trauma. You can get it now on Apple, Amazon Prime. You get it on your boat, get it in your ute. What did we say before there?
You can get it from, just go to trauma.film and it tells you every which way you can get it.
Thanks, guys.